It is really such a delight to host Professor Eli Wheat, who will be speaking about bringing carbon home, regenerative practice, a bioregional solution for a better planet. Professor Wheat is an associate teaching professor in the College of the Environment, in multiple programs, Program on the Environment, School of Environmental and Forest Sciences, and also a core faculty in Food Systems, Nutrition, and Health. Professor Wheat teaches extensively, including with the Urban Farm, and has won numerous teaching awards, but also owns and operates a 20-acre organic biodynamic, is it biodynamic? No, an organic integrated farm out on Whidbey Island, and in his spare time does some research, in addition to many other things. So today, we're going to have Professor Wheat share with us some of the work that he's been doing about carbon sequestration, about kelp, and within the context of future of food systems. So please join me in welcoming him up to stage. Thank you so much for being here. It's really a pleasure to have you. Thanks, Eli. I'm going to just change this around.
Oh my gosh, it's been so long since I've done those things. All right. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah? Great. Well, gosh, I wasn't sure how many people would be here, but it's such a great thing to be back and standing in front of students and talking to students instead of in my living room. I'm still doing a lot of teaching from my living room, so it's really nice to see you all in person. Thank you for making the effort to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about carbon because it's on my mind, right? And I think a lot about the food system, and when I think about the food system, I'm thinking about carbon, because carbon is this great unifier. It brings all the pieces together, and we don't often think about it. It turns out there was a study done, I think this was about 10 years ago now, with a bunch of graduates who were leaving Yale, and those students that were leaving Yale, and they really didn't get this connection between breathing and carbon dioxide and photosynthesis and carbon capture. And that great connection point between our breath and photosynthesis as a process and the capacity to capture carbon and turn it into long-term storage, things like wood, but also things like soil, was a piece that was missing from so many people's understanding 10 years ago. But even now, I think that most people really have begun to get to a place where they really get that, right? So that we get this sense, like we take a deep breath, and in our breath, we're breathing in oxygen, and as we breathe out carbon dioxide, that's carbon in a gaseous form, and wood is carbon in a solid form, and fossil fuels are carbon often in a liquid form, right? So we begin to make this big connection across carbon in all its forms as it moves even through our own bodies, which I think is a really exciting thing to think into. So I titled the talk today, Bringing Carbon Home, because I think a big part of the future of our food system is this wonderful opportunity for us to begin to interact with carbon in a way that regenerates the capacity of our planet to sustain life into the future. To begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement, and I know you all have talked a little bit about the importance of land acknowledgement and that you've heard from Polly and others in this practice and its importance to our university and in honoring the place where we are. So the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot nations, and the Duk-Duwabish, the Duwamish tribe. This is a really important moment that we're living through, and it's such a wonderful thing to be in a place where this is becoming a practice that we do. Like all practices, it can transform a little bit of who we are and how we relate to the place that we are. And one of the things that's been absolutely wonderful during the pandemic, there's like some very wonderful pandemic things, and one of them for me is that I have developed a practice of yoga. And I don't have any of you ever done yoga? Okay, great, because you're people of the world and you have these experiences as people of the world. But I started doing yoga, and one of the things about yoga is that you spend a lot of time breathing. You just breathe, which seems like that should be trivial, but in fact, it's actually really intense when you start to focus on your breath and you really think about how your breath connects you to your body and to this place. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the things that we practice have these transformative like moments, right? They begin to change who we are. They change our relationship with ourselves and with the people around us. So I think I thought it would be fun to have a blank slide here to just take a breath together. And we could all just have a moment and breathe. And knowing as we breathe in, we're breathing in oxygen. And as we breathe out, we're breathing out carbon. And if we think about that, that carbon has the capacity to do and become a lot of different things. That carbon can become part of a leaf, going into a tree through the stomata of the leaf, and helping that tree build complex carbon molecules like lignin that form the basis of hard things like wood. That carbon molecule could float around in the air and eventually dissolve into the ocean, right? Where it could create what is one of the big challenges to biodiversity on our planet, right? A more acidic ocean, right? And not only is that a challenge for wild biodiversity on our planet, but that's a challenge for our food systems, for fisher people around the planet, but also a challenge for cultivated world food systems in the ocean. That carbon could hang around for a while and get breathed into someone else's lungs. And oh my gosh, are you not thinking about the coronavirus? All of these opportunities, right, for our breath to interact with the world. It's a really transformative practice. We do it every day, all day long. So we have to start to think about carbon and all the different ways that carbon moves through the world. And I think it's really wonderful to think about how we're connected to the whole world just through our breath. Yeah? Gosh, I never really think about that, but I really like that idea. I apologize because I'm so unused to being on the front of the room. I forgot to bring the little thing that advances my slides. I have to keep coming over here. But so carbon moves all around the world. And this is just a big picture schematic diagram of some of the different forms carbon can take, right? So we know, for those of you who haven't been studying the carbon cycle for a while, I'll just run through this real quick, right? Carbon in the form of carbon dioxide can come down and become part of any kind of vegetative biomass. Plants, trees, all of our foods are built off of carbon molecules. Our bodies run off of the energy that our bodies transform by breaking complex carbon molecules apart, right? One of my absolute favorite complex carbon molecules can be found in the Mighty O donut, right? So we have these wonderful complex carbon molecules that fuel our actual bodies. And those complex carbon molecules can go into lots of different places. They can become sediments in the ocean. They can become parts of soils. Carbon is also in methane, right, from cows. So carbon moves through all of these different forms. And whenever we can take carbon out of the atmosphere and capture it somewhere, we could start to call that like carbon capturing, that act of carbon capture. We could refer to something that captures carbon as a carbon sink, a place where carbon goes and kind of gets stored in the long term. And one of the places that carbon can go to get stored is soil. And that, to me as a farmer, is like out of this world. So not only can I interact with carbon and the world through my breathing, but I can also interact with carbon and the world through my practice of farming and how I do farming and how I work with the soils on my little tiny plot of land to help the soils on my land become part of an absorption of carbon that allows those soils to be a carbon sink, a resting place, a long-term home for the world which is too abundant in carbon in the atmosphere. Does that make sense to everyone? I really believe that the future of farming is regenerative practice. And regenerative practices in farming focus on using soils to store carbon. And it's very, very exciting because a lot of people are beginning to realize just how important soils could be in helping solve our climate challenge. It's actually kind of important to stop for just a minute and realize we can't solve our carbon challenge simply by changing how we farm. We can't solve our carbon challenge unless we are capable of creating smart policies that help us keep carbon in the ground, right? We need a twofold approach. We need one that does creative, beautiful things like figure out how to capture the carbon we've released. But we more importantly need sound policy that helps keep carbon in the ground. So today I'm going to be talking about a really sexy idea. Well, this is the kind of thing that I think is really a sexy idea, which is using soils to capture carbon, right? That's a cool idea. But I don't want you to get too lost in the solution space because we haven't dealt effectively yet with the problem space, which is how we keep carbon in the ground in the first place. So I hope you can hold both those things in your mind as we work through this conversation today. But one of the things that's very, very exciting to me is that as a farmer especially, I got taught about soils in one worldview, but we've now begun to think about soils in a different worldview, and that's a worldview that really sees a soil as a living system. That's super exciting. Like, okay, it's not this dead thing. It's this living, breathing system, right? So the soils are living, breathing systems. So there's sort of this emergent views of soils. And those emergent views of soils are beginning to recognize the deep importance of carbon. Now, when people talk about carbon in soils, they're mostly not talking about, they often don't say the word carbon. They often use the word organic matter. So in this talk, I'll be using those two words simultaneously, and hopefully that won't confuse you. So as scientists are beginning to understand the dynamic properties of soils and its ability to hold carbon in long-term storage, people are beginning to realize that soils and even agricultural soils, and actually especially agricultural soils, could be a big part of our climate mitigation efforts. And in particular, this graph is really showing the capacity of grasslands to absorb a lot of carbon dioxide. It's completely fine. If you have questions and you want to ask a question, you can interrupt with questions because that will be more fun. So don't hesitate. If you're like, have a question, like, I want to ask a question, Eli. Please. Yeah, so the bars are talking about the magnitude of the possibility of using that type of system, either a forest, agricultural, grasslands, or wetlands, the possibility of using those as carbon sinks. So on the left-hand side, how much carbon can be stored there. And the white portions are talking about sort of vegetation, and the darker portions are talking about ways that can get stored in the soils of those systems. So yeah, really exciting research that's just coming out thinking into that. And one of the ways that we can start to really capitalize on this capacity of storing carbon in soils is to begin thinking about how we practice regenerative farming. And regenerative farming is a type of farming that really focuses on developing the soil as an ecosystem. And so they're doing all of these different things. And so they have outcomes, that's kind of the top of this diagram, and then processes or activities that regenerative farmers practice. So here are some of the practices, and you might begin to move beyond organic. I would encourage you to move beyond organic in your critical thinking about your food and into relationship with farmers and relationship with people that are practicing agriculture, because then you can really get into these questions, right? So how is the person who's producing your food focused on minimizing inputs to that system? And inputs might be things like fertilizer or water. How is that person that's producing your food practicing a diversified form of agriculture, producing more than one crop? How is that person who's producing your food minimizing their use of tillage in the system? How are they practicing crop rotation? Are they using manures and farm-based composts to maintain fertility in their systems? How are they incorporating perennials? Those are plants that come back year after year. How are they incorporating perennials into their farm? So those are some of the activities that people talk about when they talk about what is regenerative farming. But all of that is really focused on carbon, or put differently, put in the terms of a farmer, how that's really focused on organic matter. And that's because organic matter does amazing things like magic in the soil. And so you don't need to know anything, because this is a complicated picture that comes from a soils science book. But what's really fun about this picture is, like, up here in the top left, you add organic matter and crazy things happen and you get healthy plants. So that's the take-home message of this. It was built for farmers. It's like, you don't even think too hard about it. Just add organic matter and you get healthy plants. So farmers have begun really thinking into, how do you get organic matter in soils? And it's really important at this moment to take a quick pause and just reconnect with your breath, because that's how we get organic matter in soils. Plants breathe in our carbon dioxide. They bring that carbon dioxide down into their bodies. And a lot of the body of a plant is located in places we can't see. A lot of the body of a plant is located below ground. And actually, I was telling Yona that so many years ago, I had the opportunity to welcome Wes Jackson from the Land Institute to this actual room. And in this room, he brought a life-size diagram of this grass, and he rolled it down the aisle. It was so cool. He unfurled a banner, and the banner was like, it was like 12 feet long, because that's how long in the underground of the soils the plants in the Kansas prairie grow. And those root systems are growing, and they're depositing their carbon, organic matter in the soils. And it's a really exciting thing to think about that. Roots as sort of this breathing system underground. Breathing in, growing, and then grass dies back in the winter, and they deposit that organic matter deep underground. The roots senesce, and you can see that cycle of growth and senescence in this picture. And they deposit, as they senesce or die back, they deposit in the ground organic matter, complex carbon molecules stored. And those complex carbon molecules are really important for the living system of the soil itself. They're the food of the fungal and bacterial communities that maintain the essence of soil health. It turns out that one of the first things farmers like to do when they start growing plants is they go out with their plows and their tractors and they mow things down and they till things up and they turn everything upside down. And they create this great big soil disturbance. But more and more we're realizing that if we can reduce the amount that we disturb the soil, we can maximize the amount of carbon that we're storing. So this is what happens. Oh, it's a challenge to see that. It's much easier to see on my computer. But I don't know if you can see here. So this is a perennial grass system, a grass that hasn't been tilled up. See how complicated and bright those roots look? There's a lot going on there. And on this other side of the diagram is an annual plant, one that's planted each year and then the soil is tilled. And you can see there's a lot less going on. There's a lot less going on in the root system under those plants. So I'm really excited about perennial systems, and these are some of my very own goats. I'm really excited about pastures and how we can manage pastures to capture more carbon, to store more carbon in the soil. But of course, I'm a farmer by accident, really. What my actual PhD is in marine ecology. And for many years, I've been trying to think about, well, how can Eli incorporate marine biology and farming practice, and how can we do these complicated things? And can we ever bring those two ideas together? And lo and behold, along came this plant of generation. So this is how I'm getting to this really cool thing. Is everybody are you all doing okay? Okay, thank you. So I got to be excited about kelp. And the reason I got excited about kelp is a story that I'll unfold here with you all. But just hold in your minds for a minute, soils can store carbon. I hope I made that point. That's the first step in my lecture. Now we're into the second step in the lecture, which is the incredible capacity of kelp to grow underwater and to do what plants do best, which is remove carbon dioxide from the environment. And of course, underwater marine plants remove carbon dioxide from the marine environment, and carbon dioxide in the marine environment is what's driving the acidification of the ocean. And you all know this because you're UW students. But it turns out kelp is this fascinating plant because you can also use it to feed people. So you could grow kelp in the ocean, and then you can turn it into food for people. So you would have grown kelp in the ocean, turn it into food for people, and helped solve ocean acidification right in a local area, say like in the Puget Sound. So that's a very exciting thing. But researchers are getting more and more excited about the possibility of pulling carbon out of the ocean, feeding people, and then taking what's left over and using that leftover kelp product to stimulate grass in above ground systems, or grass growth in terrestrial systems. So that is what I'm going to talk a little bit about. So there is only one farm of kelp here in Washington State, and this is what it looks like. It's here on the Hood Canal, and it's located about 7 miles from my farm, which is located on Whidbey Island. And about 3 years ago, they grew their first crop of kelp here underwater. And an underwater farm is a really cool thing to think about. So you don't see a lot above ground, but below ground, there's a grid of cables, and on those cables, the kelp grows up. And so the kelp is growing like submerged in the water, and it floats up towards the surface, and that's what the kelp is doing. And so this farm is approaching kelp aquaculture in this super cool way, and they're growing not only kelp, but they're also growing oysters entrained in bags below the kelp, and they're eating the kelp, the detritus that falls off the kelp. They're also growing mussels, and they're experimenting with urchin cultivation. So they're really approaching the kelp aquaculture from a very integrated or systems level approach. But that very first crop of kelp came off the lines, and they were going to send it to people to eat. And the Washington State Department of Agriculture said, hey, hold on. You guys can't send that kelp off for people to eat yet because we don't have a process to say that it's safe to eat. So they had like 14,000 pounds of kelp and no market. And they actually were having a problem. So they were looking for some farms where they could bring their kelp. And so this was, this is the beach near my house. And we got a dump truck, and they brought the kelp on this barge and dropped it into the dump truck. And that was the first kelp that arrived on our farm with this idea of, well, could we sequester some of the carbon dioxide that kelp had removed from the ocean? Could we get some of that carbon dioxide in to the soils? And so the coronavirus kind of interrupted this research for a little bit. It became very hard to do the research during the coronavirus because I was working with students, and we couldn't get students out to my farm to do the soil sampling. And of course, I was parenting and teaching, and I didn't have time to do the soil sampling. So we ended up shifting the location of the project here to the university to some pasture out at the Center for Urban Horticulture. And we set up some plots there, and we had some kelp, and this is what it looked like. It was super stinky, and we set it out on the pasture to ask this question. If we put this kelp on the pasture, will it stimulate the grass to grow faster and help the grass, in its growing faster, pull more carbon out of the atmosphere and put that into the soils. So we had some different treatments. We covered the kelp with tarps to keep deer and bunny rabbits and all sorts of creatures off of it, but also to reduce the amount of rainfall that would hit that kelp, so we could just track what was happening to just the soil without plants there. And then we also covered some plots with a see-through cover called rime, so that let about 80% of the light in, but protected the kelp from organisms coming in and taking the kelp off. It turns out birds and other things like to come and eat the kelp, so we were trying to keep it on the ground. And then our third treatment was no cover at all. We just put the kelp on the bare ground. And then, of course, as a control, we had plots where we didn't put any kelp at all. And so across all these different treatments, we either added or didn't add kelp in replicates of 5, so we could have good statistical power. And this is what our research project looked like. And I should give a shout out right now to a UW grad. Nathan Mock did his capstone research project here. He spent 3 full quarters researching and digging and doing all sorts of stuff out here during the pandemic. And this couldn't have happened without him. But here you get a good sense of that rime covering, so that's the clear see-through cover. And then just a sense of the plots are 1 meter by 1 meter squared. So we measured all sorts of different things, but one of the things we measured was how well does grass grow? And it turns out that's a really fun thing to measure. You can take a little needle and poke a hole in the blade of grass, and you see him there with a little hypodermic needle. That was kind of funny going to Rite Aid and asking Rite Aid during the pandemic, we need some needles. It was kind of funny that they weren't so excited about giving us needles, but we eventually got some. So we poked holes in the grass and then left the grass for about 2 weeks to see how the grass would grow. So where the hole is on the outside of the shaft, the grass on the inside grows, so the hole is a stable place, and then you can track to where the next hole is on the inside of the grass. It's super fun. If you're ever interested in that, we can sit down and chat. But so basically Nathan went and he tested, and he found out that in the plots that were treated with kelp, grass grew better. It grew taller. And so we were like kind of interested in, well, is the grass just growing taller, but it's puny, or maybe it's not as nutritious or as good? So we built, this is a quadrat, and each square in this quadrat is 10 centimeters, and that's a meter by a meter grid. And so Nathan used this to sample the biomass of grass within 5 10 centimeter blocks in every plot. And what he found out was, wow, not only is the grass growing better in the plots where the kelp is, but also there's more of the grass. The biomass of the grass is a lot greater. So that's cool. Yeah? So then we started looking into the grass itself. Well, what's actually going on inside the grass? And so we were able to take some of the grass and grind it up and ask the question of how much actual nitrogen is in that grass. Nitrogen is one of the main nutrients that helps grass grow. So this plot is a little confusing. I'll just walk you through it real quick. But in the winter, that's when we started our research. There's no real difference in the winter between whether we put kelp on or not in the nitrogen inside the grasses in the winter. But in the summer, you'll see there's a really big difference. And this is the plot that has kelp, and this is the plots that don't have kelp. There's a big difference. The plots that have kelp have more nitrogen than the plots that don't have kelp. Now, if you're thinking about this graph, you might be wondering, well, why is it that there's more nitrogen in the grass in the winter than there is in the summer? And that's just because in the summer the grass is growing so fast, nitrogen is actually really limiting the growth. And the nitrogen that's available has actually decreased in both plots for the grass. So the grass is trying to suck all the nitrogen up because it's trying to grow so fast. So it's spread the nitrogen out across more grass biomass, which is kind of an interesting thing to find. But you can see there's definitely more nitrogen in the plots where there's kelp. So then we started to ask some questions about, the soils. And so we did some soil sampling, and that's Nathan's hand there, wearing a appropriately purple husky glove. And so this plot is also kind of confusing, but I'll try to walk you through. So on this side of the plot, no kelp was added, and these are all the different treatments with remay, without remay, with the tarp. So those are the treatments down here. And then on the plots where we added kelp, you can see between pre and post sampling, generally in the soils, there is more organic matter in the soils. It's interesting because in all the soils, there's a little more organic matter in the summer sampling, but that's because it's kind of a relic of the summer sampling. So we're going to actually go out soon, in the next month or so, and redo all these soil samples so we can compare January to January rather than January to June. But this is statistically different amounts of organic matter in the soil in the summer treated plots. So these are really exciting results to an ecologist, because messy data is what ecologists deal with. And so coming back to this question of pasture and what's actually going on underground. And really, I want to come back to this question of grazers, because grazers are a very exciting piece of this whole brain system that I'm working on in my mind about how could we best take that carbon that's in the ocean and bring it up and get it sequestered in soils and then have it be stable, have it stay there for a really long time. Well, one of the ways to do that is to have those soils be managed as grasslands, to integrate those soils with systems of regenerative grazing. So having, cows or goats or sheep running across pasture, but doing that relatively quickly in high densities for short periods of time. And if you can do that, then you can manage your grass really well to maximize this senescence of the roots underground. So you graze it just a little bit. Your grazer comes through and eats just a little bit of the grass, not all of it. Your roots die back a little bit, and then when they die back, they leave carbon in the soil, and then the grass grows bigger than it was before. So you get this really cool combination of things. So you're pulling carbon out of the ocean, you're feeding people with that kelp, you're putting that carbon on the pasture, and you're feeding people through the work of grazing. So again, really thinking in an integrative fashion into how we might manage soils for long-term soil storage. So we've answered this first question a little bit, which is that grass does seem to grow better when we add kelp. And we know now that there's a little bit more organic matter in those soils where we've added kelp, probably because the grass is growing better. But we can't tell for sure if the soils are getting their organic matter because the grass is growing better, or because adding the kelp actually put carbon directly into the soil. Does that make sense, everyone? It's a complicated idea. So in order to answer that question, and I texted Yona late last night, just how much do the students in this seminar know about stable isotopes? So you've had to listen to Eli already for almost 40 minutes. I haven't talked for 40 minutes in so long. Anyway, but so now you just have to really think with me for a second here. This is a little complicated, but you might remember back to high school chemistry, and in high school chemistry you were introduced to this complicated system, and so I want to focus on two naturally occurring elements, and one is nitrogen, which is very important in helping plants grow, and the other is carbon, which is really important because that's what we're breathing in and out, right? And that's what plants are capturing through photosynthesis that's allowing them to build sugars and complex molecules for their own support systems. So nitrogen has an atomic mass of 14, yeah? And if you remember back to carbon, carbon has an atomic mass of 12. Do y'all remember that? That's as I'm asking you to dredge up some potentially painful memories of high school. But the atomic mass is a measure of the weight, right? And the weighty things in an atom are the protons and the neutrons. So carbon has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. Together, that makes 12, and that's why it has an atomic mass of 12. Everybody follow that? But every now and then, you get a unique carbon molecule that's just a tiny bit bigger than all the other carbon molecules because it has a bonus neutron. And so instead of having an atomic weight of 12, it has an atomic weight of 13. And that just happens in the universe. And there's carbon out in the world that has an atomic weight of 12 and an atomic weight of 13, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's just the way the world is. Everybody follow that along? Okay. The same is true for nitrogen. So there's nitrogen that has an atomic weight of 15, and nitrogen that has an atomic weight of 14, and it behaves just the same. Okay. Everyone's following along? But it turns out they don't exactly behave the same when it comes to being metabolized. So for example, carbon, the lighter carbon, our bodies would rather metabolize lighter carbon molecules because it's a tiny bit less work. So if we have a choice to metabolize carbon 12 or carbon 13, we're going to metabolize the carbon 12. And the same is true for plants. So it turns out you can actually follow this. It's really cool. Human breath in the US, where we eat a lot of corn-based sugars, has a different stable isotope chemistry when we breathe out. So when you breathe out your carbon dioxide, and we all just took a big breath, if you've been drinking a lot of Dr. Pepper, your breath is having a different isotopic makeup than my breath. Isn't that crazy? I love that. I love science. Science is pretty much the coolest thing ever. Okay, everyone's following along, or not following along, but my point is these different carbon isotopes and nitrogen isotopes are all around us, even in our bodies, and they're cool because they become like a signature. So you might not know it was Eli that walked into the room and then breathed, but you could maybe tell that Eli, or whoever just walked into the room, hadn't been drinking a lot of Dr. Pepper because I would have a different carbon signature in my breath than someone who had been drinking a lot of Dr. Pepper or eating a lot of processed corn-based foods. Does that make sense? Michael Pollan talks about this in his book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, too. So anyway, I love stable isotopes, and they're really great ways to trace where nutrients are coming from. And so we can actually start to do some stable isotope work on our pasture. And this is like the coolest graph I've ever made in my whole life. You should have been in my living room last night because we were sort of decorating the Christmas tree, but we were also doing a little science. And so the science part got very excited at one point. And that was when this graph happened. So even my daughter was like able to see that there was something cool happening here, and she's only 12. So here we can see the nitrogen isotope data for the two plots with and without kelp in the winter, and they're the same. But in the summer, the plots that don't have kelp added have a very different isotopic signature from the plots that do have kelp added. So what we can begin to see here is that the nutrients from the kelp are making their way physically into the structure of the grasses. And that is very likely what then is driving the fact that those grasses are growing faster and growing with more biomass. And so we can begin to trace this. And so now we have some stable isotope data that we're going to be processing, looking at both the carbon isotopes in the grass, but also looking at the carbon isotopes in the soil to ask this question of, is it stimulating grass production so that we can see that it's grass putting carbon in the soil as opposed to the kelp just directly putting carbon in the soil. I don't know if that part makes sense to everybody. That's the part that's super exciting. I haven't exactly answered that question yet, but it's coming out now in my data. So that is really, really exciting. And in the beginning of this talk, I was really mentioning a little bit about how in the pandemic I started practicing yoga and just really focusing on my breath and really thinking about the pandemic and thinking about my breath and your breath and how, like, when we're breathing together, we're our breath is meeting in this really unique way in the world right now. I mean, humans, all living organisms have always been interacting with each other through our breath. But I think the coronavirus really helped bring that home for me. And this project, working on this project and thinking about carbon across these different biomes, right? So carbon on my pasture, carbon in the ocean, my breath on the farm, the soils on my farm, my breath in the water. I've also started another practice, which is the practice of swimming. So I've been swimming in the Puget Sound. I'm up to like 15 minutes at a time, which is kind of a lot in the cold water. And the practice of swimming is happening for me because on Whidbey Island, where my farm is, just off the coast of Whidbey Island, there's a beach called Libby Beach, and off that coast is a huge marine reserve. It's 23,000 acres of kelp forest, one of the largest kelp forests here in our state. And kelp forests are a wild ecosystem that are rapidly declining on account of ocean acidification. So again, tying this back to breath. And so I'm really excited to go swim there. I got to take a group of students up to this marine reserve this summer, and we were met there by a wonderful group of people called the Sound Water Stewards. And they met my students there. We spent a whole day talking about kelp and took some really amazing underwater video footage of kelp from the Libby Beach system. So this is pretty exciting. And it's really exciting for me to begin to think about how we begin to approach regenerative systems in these ways that help really close big nutrient cycle loops and can form the basis for thoughtful bioregional solutions. This kind of solution space doesn't work for a farm that doesn't live near Puget Sound, right? And that's another piece of, I think, thoughtful carbon policy is there's no one solution fits all. But this is a solution that certainly fits here. So I have a little video I thought you might like to see of some goats. I think this will work. Some goats grazing. Oh, I'm sending the program volume is going. The volume's going through my computer, but these are our goats. They're on their way out to pasture. Aren't they cute? The goats are the world's most commonly eaten meat. And this is a small herd. We have about 15 meat goats. And so these are goats that we will eat. And we're using them to practice regenerative pasture management. We've grown a cover crop here. You can see on the kind of right-hand side of the screen is a cover crop. And the goats are grazing this grass and this cover crop and the end of the season's corn crop. And one of the really beautiful things to think into as we think into our food system is there are a lot of solution spaces in our food system. And grazing is a really important solution space in the history of humans. And goats and other grazers can turn things like blackberry and grass into food that we can eat. And we can't eat blackberry and grass. But blackberry and grass are really amazing organisms that are adapted to being grazed. They actually grow faster and better after the grazers move through. So it's really exciting to think into how we can begin to build systems that grow mostly plants, but also support perennial systems and soils and all these kind of lovely and wonderful things. So I will end there. I have a little poem. I could end with a poem if you wanted, but I could end there and entertain questions if you all had any questions. So thank you. Yeah, Tansy. Oh, yeah. So Tansy's question is such an important question, which is, can livestock actually eat kelp, and are there other ways to utilize kelp in farming? This is actually two great questions. So the first is absolutely, livestock can eat kelp and other things that are grown in marine systems. And in fact, sometimes there's like on the edges of like marine areas, like cattle will come and graze grasses there. It turns out that kelp can be added to cows' diet to decrease the amount of methane they produce. So there's some great reasons to potentially be integrating kelp into livestock production. And then the other question of, can kelp be used for other types of agriculture? Absolutely. It can be used to produce, to help vegetables grow better as well. And a lot of, actually, fertilizers already have kelp as an additive to fertilizers. But one of the things about a lot of agricultural soils that are producing vegetables is those soils are not actually growing in the amount of carbon that's stored in those soils. So something to be really thoughtful about when you start to think about who's growing your food is ask to see, can you see an increase in stored organic matter in the soils in the fields where they're growing food? Because that's a rare thing to find on a farm. Does that make sense? Because of farming is hard on soils. Yeah?
Were you able to come to a conclusion on why the different isotopes were correlated with better growth?
Well, so it's not so much that the isotope is what's correlated. So the question is, why do we see the isotopes being correlated with plant growth? And it's not so much that the isotope is making the plant grow better. It's that the isotope is a marker, just like in the example of human breath, is a marker of the fact that it's a marine-derived nutrient from the kelp that's making its way into the plant. So the isotope is sort of a marker for the nutrition that's probably coming from the addition of kelp. That's a great question. Yeah. Great. Thank you all.